until the mid-2010s, I dealt with another trade, which was the trade in humans, the slave trade. And I have since moved into the fur trade. There are similarities between the two and how different cultures come together and develop these trading relationships. We see very similar things happening, but very different commodities and different consequences from the fur trade to the trade in humans. This project was actually born, so 2014, there was an initiated measure in the state. It was the North Dakota Clean Water Wildlife Parks Amendment. It ended up not passing in the ballot. It wanted to reserve legacy fund money for the environment, for waterways and parks and other things. And they had these commercials, and these commercials created this very kind of static conception of the North Dakota environment. North Dakota has always looked like this. North Dakota has always been the same. So I started talking with a geographer, Brad Runquist, who is now dean of our college, and we started talking about this, and can we kind of see what North Dakota was once like and how it's changed from 1800 to the 2000s. So we started a project where we started looking at fur trade and other accounts to come to understand what North Dakota was like before settlement and statehood in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so my talk is based on this. And the thing that struck me constantly is this notion of abundance. No problem. The abundance of natural resources, the abundance of flora, the abundance of fauna, the abundance of other things that once existed, and how this provided a foundation for life and interaction. And so what I'm going to do today is to use a fur trader. This is Alexander Henry. He is a lower Red River Valley fur trader, and he keeps a journal from 1799 to roughly 1808, 1809 of his time in the northern Red River Valley. And so I'm going to use him as the basis for this talk about abundance. We know very little about his early life till he gets into company records, till he joins the North Company, and until he writes his journal. So the estimate, he's born around 1765. He has an uncle, Alexander Henry the Elder, who was a very important fur trader within the Northwest Company. A lot of his family was involved with the Northwest Company in the late 18th, early 19th century. And we also know that in 1814, he is going to drown in the Columbia River as he's moved ever farther west within the context of the fur trade. But he is going to spend 8 years at Pemmican. First at Park River, then at Pemmican, overseeing the fur trade of the Red River. So, as I said, member of the Northwest Company, mainly trading with the Ojibwa and others in this region. As his journal starts, he's in Manitoba. He does his summer travels back to Grand Portage. So this is before the British are forced to move up, away from Grand Portage, up into Canada. And so he's part of that larger network of the fur trade originating in Montreal, moving across the Great Lakes in those canoes all the way over to Superior to Grand Portage, and then they would carry goods across the landscape up to Winnipeg. And then from Winnipeg, they would move down the Red River, they would move out over across the Souris River and other rivers. So that's kind of his background. He becomes the head of the lower Red River fur trade for the Northwest Company. He decides to establish his first fort at Park River. And so they'll arrive in Park River in the fall. They'll build a storehouse, which takes them 3 days. That's what his records say, which is quite impressive. And then they start building stocks in a place to live. Imagine what they built in a North Dakota winter, living in a wood 4x4 structure and surviving a day like today. But he is going to end up at Park River. He will trade, he will explore, and that following spring he decides Park River is probably not the best place for his headquarters, and he's going to move back north to Pemmican. And in the spring of 1801, he starts to build a new fort at Pemmican. And he will be there for 8 years. He's moving up the chain. He becomes a partner, so he has more authority. He has a greater stake in the fur trade of this region. He will travel in 1806 to the Mandan. I'll use this trip to talk about mosquitoes, an abundance of the Great Plains, as we all know. I think they were worse back then than they are now. But and then 1808, as the fur trade is deteriorating in the River Valley, he's moved farther west. And that's the basic history of the fur trade, right? You're constantly moving westward. So I'm used to lecturing to students, so I ask questions. And I'm not going to be able to not ask questions. What's the problem with the fur trade? Yeah. To get the pelt of the beaver, you have to kill it. And pretty soon you've killed all the fur-bearing animals, so you need to go somewhere else. And so there's that constant westward movement. One other thing about that, there's this excellent book called Beaverland. I forget the name of the author off the top of my head. It made me totally rethink the place of the beaver in North America. And what they talk about and what scholars are starting to do is look at the engineering of the beaver. What do beavers do? Yeah, they build dams. They block up waterways. They preserve water. They hold water. And one thing they do is they prevent flooding from their dams and other things. You eliminate the beaver and their engineering, what happens? Yeah, you get floods and other stuff. And it's going to have a rather radical impact on the environment once you start getting rid of the beavers and their engineering. And there are places in the world, in North America, Canada, other places, where they're trying to reintroduce the beaver to bring back their engineering. Oh, we live with floods here, not as much now that we have the dike, but remember they used to make that argument, we could take fields and kind of build dikes around them and use that to hold water? Anyone remember them talking about that? And sometimes they argue that Canada has elevated the roads at the border to serve as dikes, right? It's kind of what a beaver did. By building their dams, they would hold that water in and prevent it from flooding other places. So Henry is going to live and work in the Red River Valley for 8 years, and he's going to keep this very intimate journal of his time here. I kind of already talked about this, so. Yeah, this is a little later, so this is the Red River settlement. So it will be after Henry's time, but that's what they're basically building, 4x4, really basic construction of their building and post, and we see this in all the fur trade posts, the rather simplistic construction of it. I don't know why I'm kind of repetitive in my PowerPoint. I think I jumped ahead of myself. But I did just cover all this. These are the fur trade returns for his time period in the lower Red River Valley. And before we get into this, as a fisher, mink, a river otter, a dress skin is ready for use. So flesh clean, softened, stretched, and ready to go to the tanner. A shaved skin, it's in the list, and I'll talk about that in a second, has just been fleshed. And then a parchment skin has been fleshed and dried. So it's just titles for the different stages of development for the skins. So this isn't everything they're trapping. They basically trapped whatever they could, and to see what kind of market there was, and if there was a market, they would continue to trap it. If there wasn't a market, then it would slowly die off. These are the things that they're consistently trapping in this time period. Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company focus on beaver pelts, and that's going to drive them up into the Arctic. It's going to drive them across Canada in the 19th century. And as you can see, by the end of Henry's term in the lower Red River, the number of beaver are starting to decline. Has anyone ever seen a beaver in the Red River? Yeah? Nice. Guess I'm not there at the right time. I've seen some muskrats running around, but I have not yet seen a beaver. Was there a bear in University Park?
10 years ago?
Yeah, it was probably mid-2010s. Anyone else remember that? And there was bear in University Park. These are the bears over that time period. Number of wolves over that time period. These are the ones being trapped. Foxes, raccoons. I must admit, I've never seen a raccoon in Grand Forks. Are they? Okay. I mean, you would think they'd be, in urban areas, right? But yeah, in our neighborhood is just squirrels and rabbits. And crows. Lots of squirrels, rabbits, and the crows have been kind of multiplying lately. Bison robes. Bison robes will dominate the American fur trade of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. But they're really a minor aspect of the British fur trade of the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company fur trade. Fishers, otters, minks, dressed deer and moose skins, shaved and parched beech skins or deer skins. And then pemmican. Henry thinks he's a very good pemmican maker. Everyone familiar with pemmican? Dried, pounded meat, and fat, and whatever else you want to add into it. I'll talk more about pemmican in a minute. And then grease, tallow, and different types of fat. One of their main sources of grease, of fat, are bears. So they do keep the bear skins, but bears, they especially like the fat and tallow that comes from it. Becomes part of their pemmican. It's also used to prevent mosquito bites. You lather yourself in bear fat, and you keep the mosquitoes from biting you. So this is what they're trading. This is what's coming out of the Red River Valley. And they're dealing with parts of Minnesota. So this trade is expensive. They come to Park River, they come to Grand Forks, and they trade. So what he does every year is he sends traders down to these various posts. Indians will come to them, they will trade, and then they'll bring the returns in and send them across the Great Lakes back to Montreal. Some of his men will also trap. So they will go out and also find these fur-bearing animals. All right. So as I said, what I want to talk about today is abundance. This abundance we see within the records of the fur trade. First and foremost, Henry's journal teaches us a lot about the fur trade and life in the Red River Valley in the early 19th century. Within it, we see all these very traditional themes and problems and issues within the fur trade. One is alcohol. The Northwest Company, the Hudson Bay Company, have no problems making alcohol a very intricate part of their trade. The American fur trade, as it comes up from St. Louis into the Missouri Valley, the upper Missouri Valley, the United States tries to outlaw the use of alcohol. It still makes its way up. A couple years at Fort Union, they have a still. And they say it's just for their personal use. They're basically getting corn from the Mandan and making whiskey, and then using that within the trading environment. But alcohol is going to be much more pervasive within the English fur trade. One night after Henry trades alcohol, some of the Indians quarrel amongst themselves, and Cataquince jumped on Tergras and bit his nose off. It was some time before the piece could be found, so at least they looked for it. So I guess Cataquince spit it out. But at last, by tumbling and tossing the straw about, it was recovered, stuck on, and bandaged as best the drunken people could in hopes it would grow again. And we see this constantly with Henry. He complains about the consequences of alcohol, yet he constantly trades alcohol. Every time we give the Indians alcohol, there's going to be fights and problems. Yet it's a very vital aspect of that trade. So consequences of alcohol are predominant here. Disease. 1780s, smallpox. There's a nationwide smallpox epidemic. It's going to make its way into the upper Missouri. It's going to make its way into the Red River Valley. It's going to decimate the peoples of those regions. And that will continue over the course of the 19th century. Soon after Henry arrives, he reports that within 5 months, Charlo, his wife, 2 daughters, and 2 sons all die. Their complaint was a cough, which soon killed them. They were all in good health when I arrived last summer. And so there's this introduction of disease into these new groups and the consequences of that. Charlo's brother believed that his brother died because he was at the Souris River Hudson Bay post and he stole 2 horses. And when he stole the 2 horses, the doctor there, Mr. Goodwin, threw bad medicine on him and his family. So he was the one. And we see this a lot in the fur trade records of the upper Missouri Valley, how they're clearly associating disease with the Europeans. So they understand how it's getting there. They just don't understand the workings of that. 1 or 2 other themes. The idea of a country marriage. So on January 1st, 1801, Henry writes, Laird's daughter, Laird is a Ojibwa chief, Laird's daughter took possession of my room, and the devil could not have got her out. Within 6 months, Laird's daughter is now Henry's wife. And he will have several children with Laird's daughter. He is what we call, as historians, these kind of ideas of a country wife. You enter into these relationships to cement trading relationships. Now he does try to get rid of her early on, but when that doesn't work, he enters into this relationship with him. Thought this was an appropriate quote for a day like this on the next day. So she's in his room on the 1st, on the 2nd. At daybreak, I heard a crash in my kitchen and found the chimney had fallen from top to bottom. It was lying on the floor and the fire was blazing on. The cold was severe, weather cloudy and calm. The oaks made a continued cracking noise as they split with the frost, sometimes like the report of a gun. Buffaloes came within gunshot of the stockade, but the dogs drove them away. I was tempted to go hunting for 2 reasons. 1, so the men could repair the chimney. 2, to try to get rid of the encumbrance in his bedroom. He was not successful in the later. So he goes out hunting buffalo. I soon came near the buffaloes and found an Indian who had killed a cow and was cutting her up. But the cold was so intense that it obliged him to give it up and return to his tent. I fired many shots but killed only 3. It was impossible to cut them up. I contented myself with raising the fattened tongues and returned back to my fort. One last, because it's wintertime. He says this is also in that winter of 1801. It's cold, there's nothing to do, so his men therefore amuse themselves by sliding down the bank on sleighs from the south gate. Their descent is so great as to cause their trains to run across the Red River. So here's a bunch of fur traders on mid-January sledding down the banks of the Red River and sliding across, and soon they get the local peoples, the local Indians, to join them in this adventure of sledding across the Red River. So, all right. We also are going to see this issue of abundance. I ask if you've seen a beaver, which some of you have, raccoons. Anyone seen a bison around Grand Forks? Beyond the ones that are out by the airport. Kind of sad, stuck in that little pen. Fishers. Yeah. Yeah. There's a guy in South Dakota trying to reintroduce the bison, this Dan O'Brien. He also has a company that will sell bison meat that's been humanely raised and butchered and all that. So there is these attempts to restore the bison, but early 19th century, the bison are the king of the plains, right? They are everywhere. He writes, "The plains were covered with buffalo in every direction. I went hunting on foot with one of my men. We killed 3 cows. My people killed 3 bulls within 100 yards of the stockade." So they're coming right up to the fort at Pemmican. They're going to eat the cows and the bulls they use to feed their dogs. It's clear they all prefer the meat of cows, of female bison versus male bison. So when they go out hunting, they will go after the cows rather than the bulls. The abundance of bison on the plains in this time period throughout the records of the fur trade, we get what Henry Breckinridge, who goes up to Missouri in 1810-11 with Manuel Lisa, who was a Spanish fur trader out of St. Louis. And within his journal, he talks endlessly about wanton slaughter. He participates in it, but he also sees the problem within it. You got people with guns, and there's thousands and thousands of bisons around. What do you think might happen? All right, we're modern. We get out our phones and take pictures. In the early 19th century, you get out your gun. And you've heard the stories about as they build the railroads, right? People are on the trains, and they're just driving through buffalo herds, and they're shooting out their windows. They're bringing kill boats and other things up the Missouri. They encounter these herds of bison, and they shoot them. There's so many. So this is what Breckinridge is talking about within wanton slaughter. They don't think there's so many that if I just shoot at a couple, and just let them lay. No consequences to it. And we see this continuously within these records of, really, if something moves, it'll get shot, and they will shoot at it. And they do start to, over time, reflect on it, especially as we get into the mid and late century, the bison herds start to diminish rapidly. But in this time period, less so. January 14th, 1801. At daybreak, I was awakened by the bellowing of buffaloes. I got up, so this is in Pemmican, and was astonished when I climbed into the southwest bastion. On my right, the plains were black and appeared as if in motion, south to north. Opposite the fort, the ice was covered, and on my left, to the utmost extent of the reach below us, the river was covered with buffalo moving northwest. Our dogs were confined within the fort, which allowed the buffalo to pass within a few paces. He then talks about how him and his men, just from the fort, start to fire as the bison are moving by. And in the end, they kill 3. They probably injure a lot, but they only kill 3. A month later, wolves and crows are very numerous, feeding on the buffalo carcasses that lie in every direction. I shot 2 cows, a calf and 2 bulls, and got home after dark. I was choking with thirst, having chased the buffalo on snowshoes in the heat of the day when the snow so adheres that one can scarcely raise their feet. A draught of water was the sweetest beverage I ever tasted. Beyond wanton slaughter, another thing we see consistently within these records is, bison are huge. So a 1,000-pound bison will give 500 plus pounds of meat. But that's a lot of butchering. And what we see among the fur traders especially, but also the peoples of this region, is they get their choice pieces. And they talk about this consistently in the fur trade records. Everyone has their choice piece of bison. And if they kill one, they take the choice piece and leave it alone. Leave the rest alone. Any guesses what the choice pieces are?
The tongue?
Yeah, the tongue. Mid-19th century, the salted bison tongue is this like American gourmet treat. And they're just shipping back, killing lots and lots of bison just for their tongue, salting them, and then shipping them to the East Coast. Reading these records made me want to try bison tongue. And that's how I found out about Dan O'Brien down in South Dakota, and I was able, through his company, to order a bison tongue and fix it and eat it. Not bad. It wasn't salted. It's a lot of work, but they sell it, so I tried it. My dad enjoyed it. Let's eat something weird. When else are you going to eat a bison tongue? But yeah, tongue, ribs. So they all have these pieces that they like, and when they kill one, they'll take their choice pieces and leave the rest of the carcass lie, which then goes back to why there are so many predators, right? Why are there so many wolves? Yeah, they eat the kill. They got this ready, and the accounts are just full of the number of wolves that are out there, the number of bears, the number of other things that will feed on this wanton slaughter as it occurs. So they're dependent upon the bison. The native peoples are dependent upon the bison, not only for meat, but also for their robes, their skin, and then for their bones and other things. And yeah.
Is there a reason why the spike up 1.4 or 5? Any question?
Back here, the spike on what one? I think a lot of that is just more established and taking the time to get the Indians to focus on trapping. So what happens in the fur trade, so Indians use furs, right? That's their clothing and everything else, but what the fur trade wants is a constant supply. And so once they've established that economic relationship, the Indians will focus more time on acquiring the furs. Because if you get the furs, then you can get knives, blankets, guns, and other things. I think that's what's explaining that increase, and then that increase of trapping is going to explain the decline as they start to kill more fur-bearing animals. One or two last things about the bison. The bison were also victims of their environment. So this is April 1st. He writes, the river clear of ice, but drowned buffalo continue to drift by entire herds. Several are lodged on the banks near the fort. The women cut up some of the fattest for their own use. The flesh appeared to be fresh and good. Really astonishing what vast numbers have perished. So it's wintertime, the bison are walking across the Red River, and then they start to fall in. And then they'll fall in, and they will drown, they will freeze, and then that becomes a system for people to go out and collect meat. One of my men found a herd that had fallen through the ice in Park River, and all have been drowned. They were sticking in the ice, which had not yet moved in that part. The women had excellent sport in raising the back fat and tongues. So you have these bison drowning in the Red River. Also happens in the Missouri River. The local peoples will use this meat. The Mandan, one of their delicacies was drowned bison. And in the spring, the Mandan would make a lot of effort to go out, and as the ice melted and the drowned bison start to pop up, to harvest them and then consume them. One of the rationales there is by, March, April, their supply of food is minimal, and so they'll eat whatever they can get. But a lot of people comment on their love of kind of putrid bison meat, or frozen, drowned bison meat. A month later, he writes, the stench from the vast number of drowned buffalo along the river was intolerable. They tell me the number of buffalo, this is after some hunters returned, lying along the beach and on the banks above passes all imagination. They form one continuous line and emit a horrid stench. I am informed that every spring it is about the same. So this is a tradition. They not only have to worry about being hunted, they have to worry about wintertime, and the other thing they have to worry about is fire. Fires were constant on the plains, either intentional or unintentional. Henry will start a fire to kind of clear the land. At one point, the Sioux would often catch the prairie on fire after an attack to kind of cover their tracks so that people could not follow them. And then storms and other things would start other fires. So fires were quite common. Late November, he reports, the plains burned in every direction and blind buffalo seemed every moment wandering about. The poor beasts have all their hair singed off. Even the skin in many places is shriveled up and terribly burnt. And their eyes are swollen and closed fast. It is really pitiful to see them staggering about, sometimes running afoul of a large stone, at other times tumbling downhill and falling into creeks not yet frozen. In one spot, we found a whole herd lying dead. The fire having passed over only yesterday, the animals were still good and fresh, and many of them exceedingly fat. So they were then able to go out and harvest these bison. I just looked at the time. I'm really talking a lot. How long am I supposed to go?
As long as they're willing to listen.
Yeah, I mean, so when are you going to rebel against me and just start walking out? So do I need to get pithy? I'm sorry, I'm kind of rambling on. You start reading this stuff and it just kind of becomes part of you as a scholar.
Well, is there any mention of birds? Obviously, with all these dead animals about all the time, there had to be many birds in the sky. Did you mention that?
Yeah, they talk about, one spring he'll talk about just the number of bald eagles that are feeding on the carcasses. The birds become part of this. I'll try to kind of move on. Lots and lots of other fauna that they're going to he spent a lot of time talking about raccoon hunting. It seems to be a sport for him and his men, going and finding hollow out trees, lighting a fire in it, and then if any raccoons pop out, they kill them and then skin them. They hunt bear the same way. So he talks about that. In the records we see, so this is an Indian, this is Caitlin, an Indian hunting antelope, and this is something we see, it's quite common, talked about in the records. How do you hunt antelope? The argument is they're very skittish creatures, but they figure out if you put a flag out, they'll become curious, and they'll come up to it, and if you're laying in wait, then you'll be able to hunt them.
Most of this goods went through transport to Montreal.
Yeah. Yeah, so every spring, every summer, they'd get all the furs together, they'd send them up to Winnipeg, and then they would move them across to Grand Portage. They'd have their kind of celebratory rendezvous there, and then they'd move across the Great Lakes to Montreal, where they'd move to Europe and other places. And then as they come back, they bring all the goods of the fur trade with them. And so all these things are moving back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So yeah, lots of talk about birds. A lot of talk about the predators, wolves. Wolves are just readily abundant. At Fort Union, they talk about how at night they just sit up on the ramparts and shoot wolves all night because there's so many running around. And they make lots of attempts. All these animals, they try to domesticate all of them. Oh, we found a baby bison. We brought it back, put it in the fort, and we'll try to domesticate it. Oh, we got some wolves. Maybe we'll turn them into dogs. We'll bring them back, domesticate them. And so they make these attempts to take these animals and domesticate them. Another interesting thing about Henry is he does talk about fishing. The Upper Missouri fur traders never talk about fishing. But Henry talks a lot about fishing. My people went out to sea and soon came back with a sturgeon, 3 catfish, 8 bream, which are sunfishes, 4 achigan, which are smallmouth bass, 5 doré, which are walleye, 3 pike, and a few lacache, which are a Winnipeg herring. Where's the next one? A couple years later, set a sturgeon net. Has anyone ever caught a sturgeon in the Red River? No. This is on the red. Set a sturgeon net. The first ever put in this river, the usual manner of taking sturgeon being with the seine. It required 90 fathoms of net to cross the river as the water is high and the strong current forms a great bend. With much difficulty we could set it. He learned this from the Indians who also set traps to catch sturgeon. So especially in the spring, they eat a lot of sturgeon, Red River sturgeon. April 18th, my people are all unwell. As usual, every spring on the sudden change of diet from flesh to fat sturgeon. They are troubled with a dysentery that reduces them very much. They are extraordinary gourmandizers, and sturgeon oil is too much for them. We take large fat pecanu, which is an oily sucker, in our sturgeon nets. They are excellent eating, but too oily and tend to increase the disease. So they're going from bison flesh to fatty sturgeon in the spring, and it creates problems for them. At one point in their sturgeon nets, they actually catch a wolf. He's trying to understand why a wolf ended up in their sturgeon net. All right, some plants, quickly. Henry doesn't talk about this as much, but the rest of the records talk about these a lot. Has anyone ever had a prairie turnip, a pomme blanche? They used to be everywhere on the plains. And it was a very important source of food. They would, this is a stick, so this is another Caitlin image, but that is the stick that they would use to go out and harvest the pomme blanche, the prairie turnip. And then they would either boil them and eat them, or they would dry them, pound them into a powder, and then save that for wintertime, where they would mix it with other foods. I once went on the internet trying to find seeds. I'm like, I should try to grow a prairie turnip in my garden. I wasn't very successful in finding anyone selling seeds for prairie turnips. They might still be out there on the plains if you know how to identify them.
Basically live off the land. He didn't have
Yeah, I mean, everything they harvest, so they kill a bison. If they have the time to butcher fully, they're going to eat some of the meat fresh. Everything else is dried. It's dried in the sun. You just stick it out in the sun and let it dry, and then that's what you use when you have no other food. Berries, other things, fruit they talk about, you eat them fresh and you also dry them, and that becomes an important part of pemmican. The prairie turnip is going to be a form of starch. And so they eat them fresh, or they dry them and turn them into a powder, and then they mix that with any other stuff they can. There's some of the fur traders talk about the meals they have balls of prairie turnip powder with some meat and other stuff in it that's been boiled. Kind of like Plains matzo ball from a very different cultural perspective, right? But Henry talks about this region, so they use the small bastard maple to create sugar. Doesn't produce as much as the other maple, but it is a source of sugar for them. And so they will have sugar. He also talks about their eating of the bittersweet. So he writes, the bittersweet, which is often eaten by the natives in time of famine. There are two species of this shrub. One grows much thicker than the other and is very sweet, but too astringent. The smaller kind is more insipid and less unwholesome. They cut it into pieces and boil it along with thyme when the bark is peeled off and eaten without further preparation. I have subsisted upon this bark for days, but always found my weakness increased upon me. So they know what they can and cannot eat. I have not been able to figure out what this is. He writes, women are gathering rat tails to eat. This root is about the size of a pipe stem and from 6 to 10 inches long. A number of them grow from the same stock in ponds and marshes. They are of a yellowish color, tender and pleasant to taste at all seasons, but particularly in the spring. Any guesses? At one point I thought maybe a type of radish. I found a rat tail radish, but its origins is in China. Could have made it to the Red River Valley.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe cattails.
Yeah, I'm betting it's cattails.
But they're eating the root of it, maybe?
Yeah, there's certain ones that are.
You can eat? Okay. Thank you. That's good to know. Especially in the Red River Valley, fruits and berries. After the rain, the man began fishing as usual, while others went in search of fruit, of which they found great plenty, such as red plums, panbanas, which is cranberry, high cranberry bush, and grapes. The plums are just now ripe and very good. They appear to be 3 different sorts, large yellow speckled, large red, and small red. There are also 2 other kinds, small gray speckled and small yellow speckled. The penbana is fine and large, of a beautiful red, but requires the frost to ripen it. The same is the case with the grapes, which are of a small sort. At one point he writes that there's so much, all the fruit trees are in flower, and then the smell in the air is sensational. And then they go out and harvest all this. All right. Another abundance of the plains, water, fire, and mosquitoes. As we all know in Grand Forks, especially in springtime, water can be in abundance. And we have reports, Henry talks about the river flooding and his fear of the flood. One spring, the water keeps rising and rising, and first he builds a scaffolding within the fort to put all their goods in case the water continues to rise. And then he decides, you know what? We better just get them out of the fort. And so he finds a place on high ground a mile away to move all their goods. The water continues to rise, and he's like, we put everything in our canoes, and we're just ready to go when the water reaches us. So the annual flooding of the spring runoff is something that he talks about. We'll talk about fires. both intentional and unintentional, and their role within the prairies. And as we know, fires are important to environmental rejuvenation, and some are intentional, some are not. They can all be very destructive, especially when they come at your fort or where you're at, because you can't outrun them. And so they're always on the lookout for fires. Since it's winter, let's talk about mosquitoes, which, in a couple months we'll be concerned about once again. One of the most interesting parts of his narrative is when he decides to go visit the Mandan in 1806, and they're going to do it in the spring, and they're going to find the plains. The plains are flooded. Everywhere they go, there's just water standing everywhere. And since there's water standing everywhere, there's mosquitoes everywhere. So we depart. We are plagued with clouds of mosquitoes. Henry's a smart guy. I had made a kind of mask of thin dressed caribou skin. So he takes caribou skin and makes a mosquito mask for his head. So here's this white guy walking across the plains with a mask of caribou skin to try to prevent the mosquitoes from eating him alive. To cover the head and face, and thus was more at ease than my companions, who could scarcely defend themselves from the troublesome insects. The traveling was tedious from heavy rains, which made ugly and laborious walking for our horses. The soil is a stiff black mold through which the rain does not soon penetrate, but when it is once thoroughly soaked, the water cannot drain off. So it's going to be a very long, painful trip for them. We had a heavy rain during the night, and our worst enemies, the mosquito, were more numerous than ever. So each day they're getting worse. We had flattered ourselves that the season for these infernal insects was nearly over, but they annoyed us sorely this evening. Every time I landed, so they're trying to cross a river. Every time I landed, the mosquitoes plagued me insufferably, and still worse, the horse I had crossed over upon was so tormented that he broke his fetters and ran away. So he also talks about the horses being tormented from these mosquitoes. They just crossed a river, so they stripped off all their clothing, just crossed the river. So he writes, I was under the cruel necessity of pursuing him on the plains entirely naked. Doesn't say if he still got his caribou mask on or not, but fortunately I caught him and I brought him back. I suffered a good deal from the sharp-pointed grass prickling my bare feet, and mosquito bites covered my body. The water in this river is always excessively cold, and by the time we got all over, our bodies were as blue as indigo. We were shivering like aspen leaves, and our legs were cut and chafed by the coarse, stiff grass. The bright point was we shot an old swan and caught 2 young ones that could not fly. This made us a comfortable supper. After a day of misery, they feast upon some swan. All right. Henry, as you get into his records, he is very proud of his pemmican. A brilliant recipe, and he is a very good creator of pemmican. Pemmican fuels the British fur trade of this time period. So pemmican is dried meat, which is pounded. So they take it and they pound it into a powder, and then they just mix it with fat, with tallow. On equal portions, 50-50, Henry goes more 60-40, 60% fat, 40% pounded meat. You can also add berries and other stuff with it. And this is the food that lots of people subsist on because it's durable and it has lots of calories and energy. There's a very good book by George Colpitts, who's up at the University of Winnipeg. He calls it Pemmican Empire, and he shows how for Canada, the Canadian bison herds are basically eliminated because of pemmican. because they're sending all these fur traders up into the Arctic, and what they send with them is just massive amounts of pemmican. This is what you're going to survive on. This is what you're going to eat day after day after day after day after day after day. And if we want to get these furs, we need to have this vast supply of pemmican, and that will lead to the extermination of the Canadian bison herds. The American bison herds are eliminated courtesy of wanton slaughter, courtesy of the appeal of the tongue, the rise of the bison robe, the use of bison leather, and then of course the American government officials within it decide one way to pacify the natives and make them sedentary on the northern plains, especially the Sioux and others, is to eliminate the bison. If there are no bison that they can survive on, then they're going to have to go to reservations, they're going to have to learn to engage in agriculture, they're going to have to become sedentary, and they'll do what we want as we civilize them. But pemmican is going to be something that he masters in the Red River Valley. One last thing, I promise. His garden. Henry loved his garden. I have not yet found any other evidence, so I would argue that this is probably the first European-style garden in what becomes North Dakota, what Henry does at Pembina. He will plant a variety of vegetables, which probably marked the first time that they were planted in this region. And he spends a lot of time in his journal talking about his garden and what he gets out of gardens. And when I moved here, so I was in Western Pennsylvania. Before that, I was in Ohio. Moved here, bought a house that had a space for a garden, and my first thought was, how in the hell can you grow anything here? Right? You got 3 months. What's going to grow? I grew up in Ohio. You could plant early May. You got these long, long summers, and I'm like, this is going to be an exercise in futility, but Dr. Eisenminger, who's not here today, and also Kim Porter, another person who was in the department at the time, they're both like, oh yeah, just plant some stuff. It'll work out. And every year I'm amazed. Throw seeds in the ground, and it's like, wow. That was my tomato this year that I found hidden in my garden. I put it next to a antelope for scale. Thing was massive. It was also still good. It's one of those that kind of hides itself in the back, and then you find it. Like those zucchinis that get this big. Then you try to give them to your friend. You want this? Nobody wants the giant zucchini. We want the small ones, the nice ones. So Henry, he likes his garden. And he's going to introduce this kind of European style of gardening into the Red River Valley, into what becomes North Dakota. So in April of 1801, when he is deciding he's going to move from Park River to Pembina as his headquarters, he encounters some traders, and they have potatoes. And they give him the potatoes. So it's 30 small potatoes. And actually, you read the fur trade in the Missouri, the Mandan and others, and they will actually talk. Oh, if you go that way, you'll find potatoes. And they're talking about Henry and the Red River Valley as people come up and they hear, oh, there's potatoes available. They're only 200 miles away, but we do have potatoes. So even before he starts building his fort at Pembina in 1801, he plants his garden. He plants his potatoes, and he has some other seeds that he also plants. By 1804, the local native women will also be growing potatoes. So his experiment in growing potatoes in this region is going to be a success. Some of the things he plants: potatoes, turnips, carrots, beets, parsnips, onions, and cabbage. And as time goes on, his garden gets ever bigger, and as time goes on, his garden produces ever more. And he keeps expanding his garden over the years. So October 1804. Snow. I took my vegetables up. 300 large heads of cabbage, 8 bushels of carrots, 16 bushels of onions, 10 bushels of turnips, some beets, parsnips, etc. The 20th, I took in my potatoes, 420 bushels, the produce of 7 bushels, exclusive of the quantity we have roasted since our arrival and what the Indians have stolen. He actually starts having guards on his garden to keep the Indians from stealing his vegetables. And that's probably why around 1804 he starts giving them seed potatoes to start growing their own. That he will have guards, armed guards around his garden to prevent people from taking it. What the Indians have stolen must be at least 200 bushels more. I measured an onion, 22 inches in circumference. That's one hell of an onion, right? A carrot, 18 inches long and at the thick end, 14 inches in circumference. A turnip with its leaves weighed 25 pounds and the leaves alone weighed 15 pounds. I once had a picture of a turnip like another one that got lost in my garden, and I pulled it out and it was just massive. It's like I can't do anything with it. It's all woody, but it was a giant, giant turnip. The common weight is from 9 to 12 pounds. These are his turnips without the leaves. So he's becoming ever more dependent on this garden. I gathered my cucumbers and made a 9-gallon keg of pickles, having plenty of excellent vinegar from maple sap, little inferior to that imported. So probably the first pickles made on the Red River is with Henry. 1805, the men gathered the following: 1,000 bushes of potatoes, 40 bushels of turnips, 25 bushels of carrots, 20 bushels of beets, 20 bushels of parsnips, 10 bushels cucumbers, 2 bushels melons, 5 bushels squashes, 10 bushels Indian corn, 200 large heads of cabbage, 300 small and Savoy cabbages. So that's his final total. All these vegetables are exclusive of what have been eaten and destroyed since my arrival. And I'll end with one more abundance of the northern Great Plains in this time period. This is in 1808, 1 June. The weather was excessively hot, 104 degrees at least. At dark, I arrived at Pemmican River, scarcely able to crawl. Swarms of grasshoppers have destroyed the greater part of the vegetables in my kitchen garden. Onions, cabbages, melons, cucumbers, carrots, parsnips, and beets. They'd also attacked the potatoes and corn, but these were strong enough at the roots to sprout again. So grasshoppers, the swarm of grasshoppers comes through. The swarms appear about the 15th June, generally in clouds from the south, and spread destruction. The very trees are stripped of their leaves. Grasshoppers pass northward until millions are drowned in Lake Winnipeg and cause a horrid stench, as I've already observed. They do not make such a formidable appearance every year. So his last abundance are these locusts, these grasshoppers that come through and eat everything in the way, including Henry's much beloved garden. Thank you for indulging me in this.
Does it talk about preserving this food for the winter, canning, or what?
It's all going to be dried.
Okay.
Beyond the pickles with the vinegar, going to follow the native tradition of drying it.
You know, the sailors would get scurvy because they didn't have vitamin C. So what about these traders you'd send up with Pemmican only for their diet? Did they get sick? Did you mention any of that?
It is common to put berries in it, so they might be getting a little bit of vitamin C, but you don't see it like you do in the maritime world. I mean, one thing you see in the northern plains in this time period is the consequences of an all-meat diet, of eating too much fat, too much bison, and not eating anything else. You know, they're definitely not following the USDA food pyramid, right? Just going all meat all the time.
They didn't have a long lifespan either, and that's probably a very good reason.
Yeah. Yeah, and they talk about the consequences of these diets, and that might be some of the motivation for Henry to plant seeds and to have a more varied diet. Yeah.
You talked about perhaps the first garden in the state. Another first, Henry's journal, is the first duck hunt ever recorded in North Dakota. And it was on November 8th, 1800.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is the location itself. As you enter Oslo from the west, on the highway, right before you get to the Red River, you can see some remnants of oxbow lakes.
Yeah.
And Henry and his partner shot duck. He commented on the brown rice there, and shot. Interestingly, there were enough that they ate them for that night. But then the next night, they were right here in Grand Forks. It was camped on the forks of the Red. And they said there were big ducks, waterfowl around there, but they didn't shoot at them because they didn't want to alert the nearby Indians.
Yeah.
And I still don't understand why, but they boiled their ducks from the previous day for supper. Not over fire, but boiled them.
They are coming from a British tradition, right? Let's throw it in boiling water. It's got to be good. Yeah. There's so much more to his record, and I would say a lot of these records are freely available online. So, and they're fascinating. Yeah.
The trappers get paid, and what did they get paid with?
So they will get paid at the rendezvous at Grand Portage, but it is a system where almost all of them were indebted. All right? So you're working for the company, and they're giving you traps, they're giving you ammunition, they're giving you guns, they're giving you a blanket, they're giving you food. If you come into camp and you want some whiskey, they'll sell you whiskey. And so a lot of them become indebted. Or when they do get paid at Grand Portage for the rendezvous, if you've never made it to Grand Portage, it's a cool place to see. If you're ever on the upper shore, the north shore of Lake Superior, make it to Grand Portage. Then you can cross the border and go to Fort William once we get that dividing line between the United States and Canada. But yeah, they're heavily indebted. And they're kind of like sailors. Once they get paid, they blow on alcohol. And then they go back and they work for another year. Yeah.
I was just going to say that the Park River joins the Red River about 30 miles north of here.
Yeah.
As the crow flies. If you go by river miles, it's 100 miles from here.
Yeah.
But just north of there, the river takes a swing way over to Minnesota for about a mile, and then comes back, there's a little narrow neck there. The Indians used to fence that off when the buffalo were on that little peninsula, and they'd form what we call a corral. They call it a park.
Yeah, park, corral, pond. Yeah, yeah.
But when I was a kid, the floods would come in and flood that. I lived right near there, and they would flood that little oxbow, and you could go out there, there'd be thousands of arrowheads, buffalo bones and teeth. In fact, after the flood of 1950, they had to stop people from coming out there, and they let the university come in and collect the remnants that covered the flood. It's really quite fascinating. But I was wondering if the university ever did, or anybody else ever did, any excavations around where Henry's dog cave was.
The university, not that I remember, maybe the state. The one problem that was 200 years ago. It's like trying to find Fort Mandan of Lewis and Clark. You know, the river has evolved over time, so it's really hard along a river to find those archaeological remains. I'll have to look in. I'm not sure if the state has tried to find it or not. But yeah, it's cool about the arrowheads and the bison bones near Park River. Yeah.
Was there any interaction that is documented between Lewis and Clark's expedition and Henry or his fur traders? There must have been some encounters.
So
At the time period.
there are Hudson Bay and Northwest Company traders among the Mandan when Lewis and Clark are there. And so they know what's going on. And part of Jefferson's motivation for Lewis and Clark is we got to get rid of the Brits. And the Brits become kind of the bad guys in this time period. Oh, they're instigating the Indians and everything else. We gotta move them out. So Henry will arrive in the Mandan after they've already gone through. But he'll talk about the metals and other things that are left behind. And I think they left behind a corn mill that's talked about. It's interesting that the Red River trade, there's kind of this disconnect between that trade and that of the upper Missouri. Any other questions? All right, yeah, thanks a lot.